He called her ugly. The billionaire tycoon didn't recognize his own wife in disguise. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse apartment on Manhattan's Upper East Side, casting golden rays across the marble floors. Isabella Chen Morrison stood at the expansive kitchen island, her manicured fingers wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, watching the city come alive 30 stories below. At 28, she embodied the picture of success that graced magazine. Covers, immaculate makeup, designer clothing that fit like a second skin, and an air of confidence that had been carefully cultivated over years of public appearances. "Mrs. Morrison, your car will be here in 15 minutes, announced Margaret, the housekeeper, her voice respectful but distant. Isabella nodded, not turning from the window. Even after 3 years of marriage, she still felt like a stranger in this palatial home that belonged more to architectural magazines than to actual living. Her reflection in the window showed a woman who had everything. At least that's what the tabloids said. Married to tech mogul James Morrison, whose net worth exceeded most small countries' GDP, Isabella had traded her career as a marketing executive for a life of charity galas, board meetings, and carefully orchestrated public appearances. Their marriage had been a merger as much as a union, bringing together her family's old money connections with his new tech empire. James emerged from his home office, already dressed in his signature Tom Ford suit, his salt and pepper hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. At 42, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had built an empire from nothing, his presence commanding even in their private moments. "The Henderson acquisition closes today," he said, barely glancing at her as he straightened his tie. "We'll need to make an appearance at the celebratory dinner tonight. Something elegant but not flashy. You know how these old money types are about displays of wealth." Isabella set down her coffee cup with deliberate care. "Of course, I'll have Sarah pick something appropriate." Sarah was her stylist, one of many people who helped maintain the image of Mrs. James Morrison. "Good. And Isabella?" James paused at the elevator doors. "Remember, smile but don't laugh too loudly. Mrs. Henderson mentioned at the country club that some wives can be overwhelming at these events." The elevator doors closed with a soft chime, leaving Isabella alone with the weight of his words. She caught her reflection again in the polished steel of the refrigerator. Perfect posture, perfect makeup, perfect clothes. When had perfection become a prison? Her phone buzzed with a text from her best friend from college, Maya. "Coffee later? I miss talking to the real Izzy." Isabella stared at the message, trying to remember the last time someone had called her Izzy instead of Mrs. Morrison or Isabella. The real Izzy, the woman who had laughed until her stomach hurt, who had stayed up all night working on presentations because she believed in her ideas, who had once worn the same jeans 3 days in a row during finals week. She typed back, "Can't today. Board meeting at the foundation." The lie came easily. There was no board meeting, but there was a fitting for next week's gala dress, followed by a lunch with other wealthy wives where they would discuss charitable causes while eating $20 salads. Walking to her walk-in closet, a room larger than her first apartment, Isabella selected a navy Chanel suit. The tags were still on. She had so many clothes that she sometimes forgot what she owned. As she dressed, she caught sight of an old jewelry box tucked behind her evening bags. Inside was a simple silver bracelet, tarnished with age, that James had given her when they were dating. Back then, he had been charming, attentive, eager to know her thoughts on everything from market trends to her favorite movies. Now, their conversations rarely extended beyond logistics and social obligations. They lived parallel lives in the same space, crossing paths at predetermined intervals like well-choreographed dancers who had forgotten why they were dancing. The penthouse felt more like a museum than a home, filled with expensive art that had been selected by an interior designer rather than chosen for personal significance. Isabella realized she couldn't remember the last time she and James had sat together without an agenda, without phones, without the invisible barriers that wealth and status had erected between them. As she prepared to leave for another day of being the perfect wife, Isabella wondered if James would even notice if she disappeared. The thought both terrified and intrigued her, planting a seed of possibility that would soon grow into something neither of them could have anticipated. 3 weeks later, Isabella stood in her bathroom at 2 a.m., staring at her reflection with growing fascination. The dinner party that evening had been another exercise in performance art. She had smiled, nodded, and made appropriate conversation about the weather and upcoming charity events while feeling increasingly disconnected from the woman in the mirror. The idea had started as a whisper, growing louder each day until it became impossible to ignore. What if she could disappear? Not permanently, but just long enough to remember who she was before she became Mrs. James Morrison. The woman staring back at her in the mirror had been sculpted by expensive treatments, personal trainers, and stylists until she was unrecognizable from the Isabella who had graduated summa cum laude from Columbia Business School. She opened her laptop and began researching, her fingers flying over the keyboard with more purpose than they had shown in months. Temporary hair dye, colored contacts, different makeup techniques. The internet was full of transformation tutorials. But this wouldn't be about playing dress-up. This would be about excavation, digging down to find the person she had buried under layers of expectation and obligation. 2 days later, Isabella found herself in a small salon in Queens, far from the Upper East Side establishments where she was known by name. The stylist, a young woman with purple streaks in her hair and an infectious laugh, didn't recognize her without the usual entourage of photographers and handlers. "You want to go brunette?" the stylist asked, running her fingers through Isabella's signature blonde waves. "That's a big change. You sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Isabella replied, and realized she meant it. The transformation took 4 hours. Dark brown hair that fell in gentle waves rather than perfect curls. Subtle makeup that enhanced rather than masked. Clothes from a discount store that fit well but didn't scream designer. When Isabella looked in the salon's mirror, she saw a stranger. And yet somehow, she looked more like herself than she had in years. She spent the afternoon walking through neighborhoods she had never explored despite living in New York for over a decade. In Soho, she discovered a small bookstore where she spent an hour browsing, something she hadn't done since college. The owner, an elderly man with kind eyes, recommended a novel about a woman finding herself after a life-changing event. "You have good taste," he said as she purchased the book. Most people don't appreciate stories about second chances. At a small cafe in the village, Isabella ordered coffee and a pastry, sitting at a tiny table by the window. No one stared at her. No one approached for a photo or tried to engage her in conversation about her husband's business dealings. She was invisible in the best possible way, free to observe and think without the constant awareness of being observed in return. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Dinner with the Steinbergs tomorrow night, 7 p.m. at Le Bernardin." No question about her availability, no consideration of her preferences. Just an assumption that she would be there, perfectly groomed and ready to play her role. She typed back, "I'll be there." But as she sent the message, Isabella realized that tomorrow night, Mrs. James Morrison would make her appearance. But today belonged to her. For the first time in years, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The afternoon flew by as she explored the city with fresh eyes. In Washington Square Park, she sat on a bench and watched street performers, remembering how she used to come here as a student, dreaming of a future that had seemed limitless. The woman she had been then would never have recognized the woman she had become, would never have understood how someone could have everything and feel empty. As evening approached, Isabella reluctantly made her way back to the Upper East Side. The doorman at her building nodded politely but didn't seem to recognize her, which felt like a small victory. In the elevator, she studied her reflection one more time. Tomorrow she would return to being Mrs. Morrison, but tonight she was just Isabella, and that felt like the most precious gift she had ever given herself. James was in his office when she arrived, door closed, voice raised in what sounded like a heated conference call. Isabella slipped into their bedroom unnoticed, carefully packing away her disguise like a secret treasure. She would need it again soon. The taste of freedom had been too sweet to experience just once. Isabella's double life began with careful planning and meticulous attention to detail. She created a schedule that worked around James's predictable routines, board meetings on Tuesdays, golf with clients on Thursday afternoons, and weekend trips to their Hampton house that she had started declining, claiming migraine headaches that were becoming increasingly convenient. Her alias was simple, Izzy Chen, using her maiden name and the nickname from her college days. She opened a bank account with money from her personal savings, rented a small apartment in Brooklyn Heights under this identity, and slowly began building a life that existed entirely outside the Morrison empire. The apartment was everything. The penthouse wasn't. Small, cozy, filled with mismatched furniture she had picked out herself. She hung her college diploma on the wall, displayed photos of her family that had been relegated to drawers in her married life, and kept fresh flowers on the kitchen table just because they made her happy. 3 weeks into her experiment, Isabella had established a routine. Mornings as Mrs. Morrison, handling charitable obligations and social commitments with her usual precision. Afternoons as Izzy, exploring the city, reading in coffee shops, or simply sitting in Prospect Park watching the world go by. It was on a Thursday afternoon that she decided to visit the Morrison Technologies headquarters, not as the CEO's wife, making a scheduled appearance, but as a curious observer, wanting to understand the empire that had, in many ways, defined her life for the past 3 years. She dressed carefully, dark jeans, a simple sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. With her colored contacts and minimal makeup, she looked like any other young professional in the city. The security guards at Morrison Technologies didn't give her a second glance as she followed a group of visitors into the building's impressive lobby. The company James had built was undeniably impressive. The lobby buzzed with energy, filled with young employees who moved with purpose and passion. Isabella found herself envying their engagement, remembering her own career aspirations that had been set aside for the greater good of their combined social obligations. She joined a public tour of the facility, blending in with potential investors and curious members of the public. The guide, the enthusiastic young woman named Rebecca, spoke passionately about the company's mission to democratize technology and create solutions for everyday problems. Our CEO, James Morrison, started this company in his garage 12 years ago, Rebecca explained as they walked through the development floors. He believed that technology should serve people, not the other way around. Isabella found herself studying the walls, covered with photos from the company's history. There was James at various stages of his career, younger, more animated, with the kind of fire in his eyes that she rarely saw anymore. In one photo, he was surrounded by his original team, all of them grinning with the infectious enthusiasm of people who believed they were changing the world. "Does Mr. Morrison still work closely with the development teams?" asked one of the tour participants. "Oh yes," Rebecca replied. "He's very hands-on. Actually, he should be in the main conference room right now for the weekly innovation meeting. He insists on being involved in every major decision." As if summoned by her words, James appeared at the end of the hallway, walking briskly with a small group of executives. Isabella instinctively stepped behind a taller member of the tour group, her heart racing. This was dangerous territory. If James saw her, if he recognized her despite her disguise, how would she explain her presence? But as James passed within 10 feet of her, his gaze swept over the tour group with polite disinterest. His eyes paused on her for a brief moment, and Isabella held her breath, but there was no recognition, no spark of familiarity. To him, she was just another anonymous face in a crowd of strangers. The realization was both liberating and deeply unsettling. The man she had been married to for 3 years, the man who shared her bed and her home, didn't recognize her when she wasn't wearing the uniform of his world. It made her wonder how long it had been since he had truly seen her, really looked at her as more than an accessory to his success. After the tour, Isabella found herself in the building's cafe, processing what had just happened. She ordered coffee from a barista who chatted easily about the weather, treating her with the casual friendliness reserved for regular customers. It struck her that this stranger had shown more genuine interest in her as a person in 5 minutes than her husband had in months. Her phone buzzed with a text from James. "Running late. Dinner reservation moved to 8:30. No apology, no explanation, just an assumption that she would adjust her schedule to accommodate his. Isabella stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Sorry, I have other plans tonight." She hit send before she could change her mind, then immediately turned off her phone, her hands shaking slightly with the audacity of what she had just done. Instead of returning to the penthouse, she walked to her Brooklyn apartment, feeling both exhilarated and terrified. For the first time in her marriage, she had prioritized her own desires over James's expectations. It was a small act of rebellion, but it felt monumental. That evening, she cooked dinner for herself, something simple but satisfying, and ate it while reading the book she had bought at the small bookstore in Soho. The silence in her apartment wasn't empty like the silence in the penthouse. It was full of possibility, of choices that were entirely her own. When she finally turned her phone back on the next morning, there were 7 missed calls from James and a text that simply read, "We need to talk." Isabella smiled, feeling more alive than she had in years. Yes, they definitely needed to talk, but not in the way he expected. The confrontation Isabella had been both dreading and anticipating came on a Tuesday evening, 3 days after she had missed their dinner reservation. James was waiting in the Somme penthouse living room when she returned from her afternoon as Izzy, his posture rigid with barely contained frustration. "Where have you been?" His voice was controlled, but Isabella could hear the edge underneath. "Margaret said you left this morning and haven't been back. You missed the foundation board meeting, and Helen Steinberg called looking for you." Isabella set down her purse, buying herself a moment to transition from Izzy back to Mrs. Morrison. "I went for a walk. I needed some air." "For 8 hours?" James stood up, moving to the window with his back to her. "Isabella, I don't know what's going on with you lately, but this behavior is unacceptable. We have obligations, commitments to people who matter to our future." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that made Isabella's chest tighten. "Our future or your future?" James turned around, his expression shifting from irritation to something approaching concern. "What's that supposed to mean? When was the last time you asked me what I wanted, James? Not what dress I should wear to a gala, not what charity I should chair, but what I actually wanted for my life." He stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. "You have everything any woman could want. This penthouse, unlimited shopping, access to the most exclusive. That's not what I asked." Isabella's voice was quieter now, but there was steel underneath. "I asked when you last cared about what I wanted." The silence stretched between them, filled with 3 years of unspoken tensions and growing distance. James finally sat down, heavily in his leather chair, running his hands through his hair. "I thought you were happy," he said, and for the first time in months he sounded like the man she had fallen in love with rather than the CEO who managed every aspect of their life. "You never complained, never said anything was wrong. Would you have listened if I had?" The question hit its mark. Isabella saw the moment James realized he didn't have an answer, at least not one that would reflect well on either of them. "I've been lost, James, for a long time, and I think we both have been." Over the next hour, they talked more honestly than they had since their engagement. James admitted that the pressure of constant growth, of maintaining their social position, of being perpetually on, had consumed him more than he had realized. Isabella spoke carefully about feeling like an accessory rather than a partner, about missing the work that had once defined her, about the loneliness of being married to someone who saw her only as she appeared in public. "I want to try again," James said finally. "I want us to remember why we fell in love." Isabella felt a surge of hope mixed with trepidation. "That means changes, James. Real changes, not just promises that things will be different." "What kind of changes?" "I want to go back to work. Real work, not just charity boards and foundation meetings. I want us to spend time together without agendas or social obligations. I want you to see me, really see me, not just the woman who looks good in photographs next to you." James was quiet for a long moment, and Isabella could see him processing this information, calculating the implications for their carefully constructed life. "Okay," he said finally. "We can try that. But Isabella, you have to understand. Some things can't change overnight. The social obligations, the appearances, they're part of what makes our life possible." It wasn't the unconditional yes Isabella had hoped for, but it was a beginning. They agreed to start with small changes, regular dinners together without phones, conversations about topics beyond business and social commitments, and Isabella's gradual return to the working world. What James didn't know was that Isabella had already begun working in a sense. During her afternoons as Izzy, she had started freelancing, taking on small marketing projects for local businesses in Brooklyn. The work energized her in a way she had almost forgotten was possible, reminding her of the skills and passion that had once defined her professional identity. That evening, they ordered takeout from a small Italian restaurant and ate it on the terrace, watching the sun set over Manhattan. It was simple, unscheduled, and more intimate than most of their formal dinners had been. For a moment, Isabella caught a glimpse of the future they might have if they both committed to the hard work of rebuilding their relationship. But as she prepared for bed that night, Isabella caught sight of her disguise hanging in the back of her closet. Her double life had given her more than just freedom. It had shown her who she could be when no one was watching, when no one had expectations of her performance. The question now was whether she could integrate that authentic self into her marriage, or whether some discoveries once made changed everything irreversibly. She had agreed to try, but she wasn't ready to give up Izzy entirely. Not yet. The woman she had rediscovered in those Brooklyn afternoons was too precious to abandon, even for love, especially for love that was still finding its way back to authenticity. 6 weeks later, Isabella's carefully constructed double life collided with reality in the most unexpected way. She was sitting in her favorite Brooklyn cafe as Izzy, working on a marketing proposal for a small tech startup, when she overheard a conversation at the next table that made her blood run cold. "Morrison Technologies is considering acquiring smaller firms in the Brooklyn area," one man was saying to his companion. "My source says they're particularly interested in companies with innovative approaches to consumer marketing." Isabella's laptop screen blurred as she realized the implications. The startup she had been working with, Tech Forward, was exactly the kind of company James's acquisition team would target. Without thinking about the consequences, she found herself walking toward the men's table. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I couldn't help overhearing. Are you talking about Morrison Technologies?" The older man looked up with interest. "Are you familiar with the company?" I work with some local businesses that might be affected. Can you tell me more about their acquisition strategy?" What followed was a 20-minute conversation that revealed more about James's business practices than 3 years of marriage had taught her. The aggressive acquisition tactics, the way smaller companies were absorbed and their identities erased, the employees who were let go in the name of efficiency. This was the empire she had been unknowingly supporting, the foundation of the wealth that had paid for her designer clothes and charitable donations. That evening, Isabella returned to the penthouse carrying the weight of her new knowledge. James was in his study, doors open for once, reviewing documents that she now understood represented the livelihoods of dozens of small business owners. "How was your day?" he asked without looking up, the question automatic and expecting an equally automatic response. Instead, Isabella sat down across from his desk. "I heard something interesting today, about your acquisition plans in Brooklyn." James's attention snapped to her, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "Where did you hear about that? Does it matter? James, do you realize what you're doing to these small businesses? They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They're people's dreams, their life's work." "Isabella, you don't understand the complexities of business strategy. Sometimes difficult decisions are necessary for the greater good of the market. The greater good, or the greater profit? The argument that followed was unlike any they had ever had. Isabella found herself defending businesses James had never heard of, people he had never met, while he tried to explain market forces and competitive necessity. It was only when she mentioned tech forward specifically that James stopped, talking, his face going pale. "How do you know about tech forward?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Isabella realized she had reached a crossroads where her two lives could no longer exist separately. She could lie, deflect, return to being the wife who didn't ask difficult questions. Or she could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. "Because I've been working with them. For the past month, I've been helping them develop their marketing strategy." The silence that followed was deafening. James stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, his confusion evident. "You've been what? When? How is that even possible?" And so Isabella told him everything. About the afternoons in Brooklyn. About the woman she had rediscovered when she stopped being Mrs. Morrison. About the disguise that had allowed her to move through the world invisibly, and the freedom she had found in that invisibility. "You've been lying to me for months," James said when she finished, his voice hollow. "I've been finding myself," Isabella replied. "And I learned something important, James. You don't know me, the real me. You fell in love with an image, and you married. Roll. But you've never actually known the woman behind it. That's not fair, isn't it? 3 days ago, I walked through your office building on a public tour. I stood 10 feet away from you, and you looked right through me. Your own wife was invisible to you because I wasn't wearing the right clothes or the right makeup." The truth of this hit James visibly. Isabella could see him trying to process not just her deception, but what it revealed about their relationship. "What do you want from me, Isabella? What do you want us to do now?" "I want you to meet me. The real me. Not Mrs. Morrison, not the woman who looks perfect in photographs, but Isabella Chen, who has opinions about your business practices and dreams that have nothing to do with charity galas. I want you to consider that maybe your success doesn't have to come at the expense of other people's dreams. And if I can't give you that, if I can't be the person you want me to be," Isabella felt tears she hadn't expected pricking her eyes, "then I guess we'll know where we really stand." The conversation ended without resolution, both of them retreating to separate spaces in their too large home. But something fundamental had shifted. The performance was over. The masks were off, and they were finally seeing each other clearly, perhaps for the first time since they had met. 2 days later, James announced that Morrison Technologies was canceling its Brooklyn acquisition plans, citing a strategic shift toward partnership rather than absorption. It was a small gesture, but it represented something larger, a willingness to consider that success could be measured in more than just profit margins. Isabella, for her part, gradually integrated her two lives. She kept the Brooklyn apartment, continued her freelance work, and slowly introduced James to the woman she had rediscovered in those afternoon adventures. Some days were better than others. Some conversations ended in arguments, others in tentative understanding. Their marriage didn't magically transform into something perfect, but it became something more honest. Isabella kept her colored contacts and casual clothes, not as a disguise, but as a reminder that she contained multitudes, that she was more than any single role could define. And James, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, began to see his wife not as an extension of his success, but as a separate person with her own complexity, her own dreams, and her own right to be known and loved for who she truly was. The billionaire tycoon had called a stranger ugly without recognizing his own wife. But in the end, it was Isabella who taught him how to truly see.